I'm going to share my screen. Maybe. Okay, there. And we're ready for that acknowledgement. I'll just change it. I'll stand over here.
Good morning. I'm Stephen Peterson. I'm a member of the Racial Justice Committee.
Here in the middle. So
Right there. Okay.
a lot of things to think about today.
And I'd like to welcome you to our Sunday forum on reparations today, both those of you attending at home via Zoom and those in our studio audience. I also want to give thanks to Carol Engel, who's been very instrumental in planning this forum this morning, along with Bradley and myself. So thanks, Carol. She's been double duty today with the shared ministry program. And I'd like to put a plug in for that. Those of you that are here that stop by the racial justice table upstairs.
Stephen, can you speak closer to the microphone, please?
Then I disappear.
Oh, that was tragic.
Oh, no.
Should I go get a boom fan? I know where they are. I'll try to get one.
The problem is the stand is not big enough for everything.
I'll be back.
It'll take it a minute. I think it'll notice it again.
There we go.
Oh. Hey, we got people at the bottom.
Oh, okay.
We'll figure that out in a minute. Okay. Go ahead, Steve.
Okay.
Just talk a little closer to the microphone.
Before we start, I'd like to share a prayer with everyone. And this is from this, the same liturgy that parts are being used in the service today. So. Jesus Christ, our leader, you are the Son of the Creator. Today we become your children. Today we become your grandchildren. We will live as you have taught us. We will follow your commandments. Watch over us. Speak to us from the trees, from the grass and herbs, from the breeze, from the passing rain, from the passing thunder, and the deep waters. Before us there is beauty, and behind us there is beauty. Allow us to walk a long life in happiness, completed in beauty. Amen.
Amen.
I'd also like to read the Gloria Day's Land Acknowledgement statement. Gloria Day Lutheran Church recognizes that its building stands on traditional Dakota land near Badote, Minnesota, the confluence of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers, the center of creation for Dakota people, and also sacred to the Ojibwe. The congregation acknowledges that this land was taken from indigenous people by exploitation and violence. Given the deep significance of this sacred ground, as well as its painful history, the congregation recognizes its responsibility to use this land, its building, and its mission for the work of reconciliation and healing with Native people. The congregation repents of this injustice that continues to harm Native communities and pledges to work for justice, peace, and the well-being of all creation. And as we move through our presentation today, I want to say that we're attempting to focus on the second part of this land acknowledgement statement, which moves us more to action and to live out that statement in the future. I'd also want to acknowledge that tomorrow is Indigenous Peoples Day in the United States, Minnesota, St. Paul, and Minneapolis, other communities, and there's many activities to enjoy today and tomorrow. And since we're celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day, it's fitting that we announce changes in some rooms in Gloria Day, at Gloria Day. The Racial Justice Committee proposed this summer, and the Church Council later passed a resolution.
I was going to show the slide, but
Oh,
here. Watch that, you gotta record it right there. There we go.
Just move that black box on the far left,
Except I don't
Bradley.
see it, it's not on my screen,
Okay.
so. Anyway. Okay, sorry.
Oh, no, that's fine. The Racial Justice Committee proposed this summer, and the Church Council later passed a resolution to rename the Colonial Room to the Mississippi Room and the American/Youth Room to the Minnesota Room. This change symbolizes Gloria. This change symbolizes Gloria Day as a place of sacred meeting, as is the neighboring Bedote, the confluence of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers to the Dakota people. An appropriate signage will be part of the Rise of a Church project. And now, before I trip over this, I'll turn it over to Brad.
Thank you for negotiating all of that. Right.
I think it'll be easier for the people to hear if you're either holding the mic or speaking right into it.
All right, I can do that, and I want to see if I can get the screen sort of. Here.
It's better now.
Oh yeah.
You wanna try this one?
No, I can hold it. I can hold it. That's
I'm
all
gonna
right.
take this.
All right, so you can, but people at home can't see the screen. So let me try that part now. All right, so there's.
Okay.
All right, so now we should get a picture. We should get a picture.
Great.
Please, there's a picture. Yay! All right. Oh, but now I can see the people on here, but you can't see the people. That's good. All right. Oh, the Holy Spirit is present. I want to start today by just kind of reviewing some of the definitions that we've been working with. Some of these we've talked about in other presentations, but I think it's important to kind of review some of the building blocks as we move forward from word into action. First, and a lot of what I'm using today comes from this book you see there on the side, Reparations, which is a guide for churches. This book just came out and is super helpful in entering into this conversation, one thing I've learned as we've thought about reparations is how many people talk about this in very superficial or a politicized way. And I think we want to try to avoid both of those things as we kind of delve into the meaning. So what I want to do today is talk about some of these definitions and then talk a little bit about Lutheran theology and how they connect together. So this is a definition of racism. Has three elements to it. First, classifying human beings into distinct races due to presumably fixed and hereditary physical characteristics. Second, assigning notions of inferior mental or moral capacities correlated to those physical characteristics. And third, pushing people who are seen to have those physical, mental, and moral qualities to the margins. And these are kind of three ways that people talk about racism. First, personal racism. This is how you feel toward people who you perceive to be different than you. Often, this is the only way people talk about the effects of racism, reducing the conversation to just how I feel about people. This is why some people say, well, I'm not racist at all. And it's because they really don't feel like they think about or feel differently toward other people. Now, that may or may not be true. social racism, which divides groups from each other. And so I should have said the first personal racism, the solution is change within, change inside. The social racism is where there are separations between groups defined as different racial groups. The solution to that is reconciliation, getting to know one another, stepping across the divide, building relationships. Thirdly here, institutional racism. This is racism that's built into structures that inhibit some over others or put some above others. I feel like this third dimension of racism has become more part of our conversation since the murder of George Floyd. And we've thought about policing and policies that govern people. So we've begun to think I live in Minneapolis, so we're voting on, question number 2, which is about policing. So this is very much part of the conversation on the block about how racism is structured. The book that I've been looking at talks about cultural racism. And what they try to do is say, all of those pieces are true. It's not like one more than the other. All of them play out through our whole culture. And racism is embedded in our ideas, our feelings, our institutions, and our practices. It's just everything has racism winding through it. We've come to name that as white supremacy. When I was growing up, the white supremacists were the Klan. It was the most extreme racism in the country. And so most people could say, well, I'm not a white supremacist. I don't dress up in a robe. I don't burn crosses. I don't say horrible things. I don't carry the Confederate flag past the State House. I've developed this term now to describe what I was just talking about. How racism is embedded in all dimensions of our personal, social, political, and cultural life. If you've looked at any of the 1619 Project, looking at the history of racism, one of the points being made in that study is that from the founding of this country, racism has been part of the building blocks of the nation. So it is part of our history. Before I go on, I want to now talk a little bit about why Lutherans should not be bothered by any of this conversation. That these are things we have been talking about for a long time. Theologically, we would say white supremacy is sin. And we talk about sin as being personal, things that we do that hurt ourselves, others, or the whole creation. But we also talk about sin as corporate, meaning there is collective sin that we are part of, even if we don't share feelings about it, or often we don't realize necessarily we're part of it because it operates below the surface. If you look in our hymnal, there is a right for individual confession and forgiveness. You can come into our office anytime and say, I'd like to confess my personal sins and seek and hear a word of forgiveness. We will make ourselves available anytime. I did that once for an entire Lent and no one came. So incredibly sinless congregation I'm serving. We also have in our hymnal a right for corporate confession, where the language isn't I confess, but we confess. And that's often used for ecology, or the way wealth works, the way the economy privileges some over others, and has been used for racism since the LBW came out in 1978. So this notion that racism is embedded in all of these dimensions of life, we have talked about and understood as a faith community from the beginning. So we shouldn't feel shocked by saying white supremacy is everywhere. And remember, even in our confession that we use from the ELW, we are captive to sin and cannot free ourselves. We are caught in something that is bigger than me. Even if I change, doesn't necessarily mean all of it goes away. It's an ongoing project. So what's our response to sin? And this gives me a chance to say, I always think we have our liturgy backwards. We should begin with the announcement of forgiveness and say, okay, now that I know I'm in your hands, I can trust to tell you the truth. Because I know you're not going to judge me, you're going to love me, so I can risk being honest. Normally we start with confession and then hear, almost like it's the, okay, you did it, now you get the forgiveness. Forgiveness is the ground, our ability, our capability of confession. So 3 parts to it. Honest, we're honesty, this is confession, we say out loud what's wrong. Repentance, change, this is the internal work. Repentance means to turn another direction, to be different. But lastly, it doesn't just end with that internal piece, right? We're called to fix what we have broken, to mend what we have wounded, to make it right again, to make amends. Sometimes this is called penance. We tend to hear about this sometimes in very stereotyped ways, like the old days from the Catholic confessional. Okay, you go and say 5 Hail Marys, and then you'll be forgiveness. But deeper and wider in the tradition is this sense of confession ends with the making of amends, changing things. So I think that's our doorway into how the church begins to understand what reconciliation followed by reparations begins to be thought about. So white supremacy, back to that concept, is the enduring legacy is theft. Something has been stolen. Identities, agencies, prosperity, systematically stolen and given to others. There's been a theft of power. There's been a theft of wealth. So why should the church even worry about this? Isn't this a social problem? We're all just fine, right? We enter into this conversation because we are called to proclaim liberty to the captives. Jesus opens the scroll of Isaiah, and that's what he reads as his own mission. We proclaim good news to the poor. And there's a special responsibility for the church to mend the nation's brokenness because our call is to love. Third, honesty in storytelling. This summer, Darren and I went to Crosby, North Dakota, where his great-grandmother homesteaded in order to get farmland. So we went to the History Museum, met a wonderful historian who found things related to Darren's family. And they have a pioneer village set up there so that you can see what life was like for these settlers. And it's very much a story of fortitude and bravery and courage leaving home from Sweden, to Norway. Sorry, that was a big mistake. From Norway, to come here and to make your own. And she married the owner of the general store, and they founded the town. And then were able to sell the store. They earned money from the farm and then moved to the Twin Cities where their life could continue. Great heroic story, right? Nothing said about who had been there first or why that land was empty and available when his great-grandmother arrived. So I think particularly for those of us in Minnesota, Lutherans, who have this kind of pioneer hero story as part of our, all the little prairie Lutheran churches, on the hill throughout Minnesota, Iowa, the Midwest. As Lutherans, we should be telling the whole story and thereby seeing we do have a special responsibility to enter this challenge and to work on fixing it, to repair it. And then last, just want to say a couple quick things. Ethic of culpability and an ethic of restoration. Culpability. Remember the story of Zacchaeus? He climbs, he's short. Anybody could sing the song? He's short, he climbs up in the tree because he wants to see Jesus. And Jesus sees him and says, I'm going to your house today. And so Zacchaeus goes. Now Zacchaeus was wealthy. He was wee and wealthy. And Jesus goes to his house. And what does he do as a response? He offers to not only give back what he has stolen, but to go above and beyond and make it really right. I forget how far above he goes. Anybody remember that? I should look this up this morning. Anyway, he goes above and beyond even giving back what he had stolen from people. This is a story in our tradition. That's the work of repair. Then ethic of restoration. And here is the story of the Good Samaritan. Samaritan walks by, wounded traveler on the road, not part of his own community at all. In fact, part of an enemy community. Samaritans and Jews, enemies. The Samaritans not only picks him up, takes him to the hotel, fixes his wounds, but tells the owner of the hotel, I will pay for whatever else he needs to be healed. That's reparation work. That is the work of restoration. So when we think about reparations, the deliberate repair of white supremacy's cultural theft through restitution, returning what one wrongfully took, and restoration, restoring the wronged to wholeness. I should say here, often people say, well, how can we this happened so long ago, how can we just send checks to people? That's one of those superficial interpretations. This is much bigger. This isn't about just writing a check and sending it as if that would even make everything right. This is about working to restore and make right and make whole, shalom, the biblical concept for all of life. As the church undertakes the work of reparations, it must mirror the threefold theft wronged by white supremacy. Not only the theft of wealth, but the theft of truth and the theft of power as well. I don't want to diminish the power of wealth in that conversation. Say, oh, well, we'll just talk about truth or we'll just talk about power. Somehow fixing it requires grappling with wealth. Gospel text for today. So let me real quick turn this over to Stephen again. in my favorite Halloween costume he ever wore, which I found on Facebook.
I might add that in a theological sense, there's something very wrong with that image.
The tie?
But the cross is very prominent. I've been asked to talk about what I've learned as Racial Justice Committee has pursued its activities. I think the first thing is this whole concept of the doctrine of discovery, which kind of hovers over all of this. And that was that mid-1400s document that said white European Christian nations could have access and claim any land in non-Christian areas throughout the world. And the scary part about that was it was a church-sanctioned decision. And many of you may remember reading your history something called Manifest Destiny, which was just used to justify the Western expansion of the United States, and in our local area, the expansion into Dakota land. And that was a direct relationship to the doctrine of discovery. And scarier still is that doctrine of discovery is not obsolete. As recent as 2005, the Supreme Court made reference to it as they decided in favor of a local community against a Native American community in a land dispute. So it's still alive and well, and that's one thing I learned. Now, Gloria Day was in the property that was bought by Zebulon Pike in 1805 for the purpose of building the Fort Snelling, what would later become Fort Snelling. So Gloria Day was tied into that property. And the one thing, negative thing I learned about that is that treaty was never ratified by Congress. Therefore, the monies promised the Dakota people were never delivered, with the exception of some of the token gifts and a very small amount of money when Pike initially talked to the people. Now in September, this past September, Gloria Day, some of you attended the Mendawakatan powwow, or Wasipi, and were involved in helping prepare the feast for their Sunday night feast and being entertained and learning about things at the powwow itself. That tribe was involved in the negotiations in 1805, but that tribe also today is not recognized by the United States and is still struggling to get that recognition. And I also learned, in the face of that, if you've been to a powwow, one of the most prominent, well not most, but one of the prominent symbols in a powwow is the American flag. And the other is the honoring veterans. And I learned that the Native community, the Native American community in the United States, has the highest percentage of military service than any other ethnic or racial group in the United States. So despite some of the negative past we talk about and refer to, they're doing a better job at this sometimes than we are. In 1850, the early 1850s, the United States decided it didn't need all of this land around Fort Snelling. They were kind of downsizing the fort. Unfortunately, instead of returning the land to the Dakota people from whom they took it, they turned it over and sold it to land developers, land speculators, and white settlers who were really anxious to get into this area. And again, that property that was sold then is where Gloria Day is. This is an 1867 map of what's called the Reserve Township of Ramsey County before it became part of St. Paul. It was called the Reserve because when it was part of Fort Snelling, the fort used this area for grazing, raising crops, cutting down the timber for building and for firewood. And Gloria Day was right there. There's 3 vertical lines. The top one that's barely visible is modern day Marshall Avenue. In the middle is St. Clair Avenue, what is today St. Clair, and below that what is now Randolph Avenue. The 2 vertical lines, the one to the west on the left is a modern day Cleveland Avenue, and the one on the right is Snelling. So if you see the intersection of Randolph and Snelling, just to the south of that would be where Gloria Day is. In fact, that next faint horizontal line below Randolph possibly could be present day Ford Parkway. And so again, it helps narrow of where. So Gloria Day is right in the middle of this transaction. So basically we're sitting on some very special land. It's special to us, it's sacred to us, and historically it's very sacred to the Dakota people. Another thing I learned is that history is and should be viewed from different angles. I relearned this, I've known this, but on a Sacred Sites tour, the guides asked us as we were looking up at Fort Snelling and overlooking Bedote, asked us to think about how we'd feel as a Dakota person to look up and see this dramatic white military presence backed up with people and weaponry overlooking your most sacred piece of property, and how that would shape your views. Something to think about for that. So we've come to love, enjoy, and use the Gloria Day property. And we've all benefited from this history, as bad as it sometimes is. Now at a 2017 forum in this room, we had a speaker on white privilege. And one of the things he started out talking about was how we shouldn't get caught up in the guilt of the past. Number one, it doesn't solve any problems. But we do need to recognize history, the good history, the bad history, the uncomfortable history, and then move forward to make changes for the better in our institutions and ourselves. So we now need to continue to honor this land that we're using and the people from whom it was taken, and take positive actions individually, collectively, institutionally to move forward as we seek reconciliation. And to do this, it'll require us to listen to the needs of people and the wants of others. So with that, I'll turn this back to Bradley.
Okay, we were going to pause there for a little discussion, but I think what I'm going to do is finish what I was going to say and then give a little longer time for discussion among you. So this next part is what might this look like if Gloria Day were to take up this idea of reparations? This is a question that the Racial Justice Committee is asking. How do we walk alongside with Native Americans supporting their goals and priorities? There are many agencies, programs that are important to Native Americans which also align with areas in which Gloria Day shares values. Recovery issues, mental health, housing, youth, family, employment, leadership development. Reparations can be volunteering, offering in-kind services, committing to financial support. So with that in mind, we've begun to gather listings of organizations or communities that are either Native American themselves or working with Native communities. And these are just a few of the ones that might be places for us to connect. The Wakan Teepee Center being built over in West Phelan. There's actually tomorrow, I think, a dedication ceremony in the afternoon at 4 o'clock. They're building, this is a place, land, where they can go for a center. National Native American Boarding School Coalition, which is here in Minnesota. The Synod just started 225 days of praying for the children, remembering children who were sent to boarding schools. The Ein Da Young Center, healing place for Indian youth, including a shelter. Engagement, prevention, chemical dependency, street outreach, keeping families together. The Tiwahe Foundation in Minnesota. This benefits and focuses on equality by offering microgrants for Native Americans to access opportunities to resources, leadership, network, and support, to live in a cultural context economically independent. The Department of Indian Works with Interfaith Action of Greater St. Paul. Our second offering for October is for the Department of Indian Works. And Gloria Day has had a long established relationship with Interfaith Action of St. Paul and the Department of Indian Works. In some ways, you could call the second offering a reparation, contributing towards the healing. Women of Nations, Eagles, Nest Shelter, women traumatized by domestic abuse. First Nations Development Institute improves economic conditions for Native Americans through direct financial grants, technical assistance and training, and advocacy and policy. Project Reclaiming Native Truth. These are just some of the many ways that work is being done that might become partners for us. Here's the proposal from Racial Justice. Since the capital portion of our budget is the portion that deals directly with our property, both paying a mortgage on it and for ongoing repairs, allowing us to use and to share our building with the community. Our proposal would be to say, what if we took 10% of the annual pledged capital budget and dedicated to the work of repair with Native communities? Almost like this is part of, when we think about our building and our land, part of our planning is to do this work of healing and repair. In a way, this is the big moment when Racial Justice is sort of beginning to say this out loud to the congregation for consideration and ongoing discussion about what this might be like. So lastly, the question really before us is, what do you think about from the beginning presentation, or just what you've learned overall through these discussions we've been having over the course of now a couple years?
A question from our online community.
Oh, thank you.
Is asking, they were explaining our land acknowledgement statement to an Indigenous person who asked them whether we had shared that statement and our mission with those to whom we are recognizing. And when he was asked that, he wasn't able to answer. So how have we, when we developed the statement, how have we shared that with the people that we're talking about?
That's a good question. When we were developing the statement, we were in conversation with people, inviting them to read it and give us feedback, Native people giving us feedback. So in that way, it was shared. Since then, I don't think this is a good question. Like, how can we make this more public?
Yeah.
It is in our bulletin every week now. It's on our website where you look at what our mission is and who we are. It's there. And part of going to the powwow this last time was the hope to start developing relationships with the Native community that gathers in our neighborhood. Like, real relationships need to be part of all of this too. So if you could just kind of gather together in maybe groups of 3 or 4 and just talk about all this with each other. What do you think? Let's do that for 8 minutes. How's that? The online people have gathered back in the big room, and so why don't we here too? I step back here, I realize, okay, there, now you can see my face. Have you been like just looking at my name tag the whole time online? So let's just, for a few minutes here, just sort of popcorn style, word or phrase, what were some of the things that came up in your group? Deanna.
Can I say a little bit more than a word or a phrase?
I knew when your hand went up first. Sure.
People at home will have an easier time if you're.
Yeah, people at home, if you want to just put things in the chat too, we'll share those.
Just try.
Yeah, it's not working.
Okay.
So I'm wondering if Gloria Day is exploring being part of the Minnesota Council of Churches Decade of Reparations. It just kicked off about 2 weeks ago. And it seems that being part of a statewide effort of churches trying to figure this out, and the effort being led by people like Jim Bear Jacobs, that this would be like joining this movement instead of trying to go it alone and figure out what we do. Seems to me like it might make a bigger impact.
Thank you for saying that. I actually thought about that
Can you repeat the
earlier.
question for people?
Oh, sorry. The Minnesota Council of Churches has started a discussion program project about the churches and reparations. It's a 10-year project that kicked off just a couple weeks ago. They had their first gathering. And earlier this week, I thought about making the slide for that, and obviously Friday when I was doing it, and I have in my to-do list for Monday is to write an email to Jim Bear Jacobs to say, here's what we're doing, we would love to be participants in that. So thank you, I'm really glad you mentioned that. Other thoughts that you had, or things that...
I don't think that's gonna work, but I have low battery. Oh, okay. Which one?
So I think in our group we were talking about, just echoing what you were saying, Pastor Bradley, about the importance of relationship and about being in relationship, and how relationships take time to build, right? The continuous showing up, not just once, but again and again, that builds the relationship. So they're baby steps, work over time to be in a relationship.
Could you hear that online? No, they could not hear that.
Oh, couldn't hear that. Oh, okay. Stephanie was saying that they, in their group, they talked about just the ongoing need for developing and building relationships, that doesn't happen in one-time involvement, or even in 2 or 3 really, but that's a long-term commitment and investment on our part in growing those relationships. Other thoughts, ideas? Hey, look, we have, let's see, is there anything in the chat here?
They're excited by the room changes and the idea of the 10% thing.
Okay.
Also glad that Racial Justice Committee is getting into action.
Okay, great. Any thoughts about that 10% idea? Did that come up in your discussion? What did you think? Paula. Then Harry.
Okay, so we talked a little bit about that, and it's we were in favor of it. It pushes us to make amends, which is a tangible way to try to set things right. Right, we can't repair everything that happened, but we can pave a new way forward. And I think coupled with our personal reflection, so here you're getting my 12-step recovery voice coming through, right? We have personal responsibility to figure out where things went wrong, And where we have awareness, we can do better. We can change, and then tie that to the amends that we're making with that capital distribution to support the Native communities.
People at home, did you hear that?
Paula, did you hear that? No. Paula was
nod.
saying their group was in favor of that 10%, that it's action on our part. It begins to address some of the wounds. Obviously, we can't fix everything, but it's a commitment and a way in. And that's also paired with then our own personal transformation going forward as we work on these issues. And I thought that was a really good point, because having to decide that every year, how we're going to do it, it's going to regularly bring us back into this conversation. And over the years, we'll just learn and grow and develop and change. Harry?
I like the idea of making it a part of our budget in terms of the capital. However, I think it's important that we not escape being responsible ourselves by going beyond that, because when it comes to what we give is one thing, but going beyond what we give and where it hurts something else is another. And I think this is such a crucial issue at this time that it's important to emphasize both.
Harry was making the point that he was in favor of the investment from the capital fund, but also not to let that be our end point, especially personally as we think of our own giving and our own participation in the world, that we don't just say, oh, the church is taking care of it, so now I'm off the hook. Is that kind of what, is that fair, Harry?
Very fair.
Okay. Mark?
I think it's a biblical truth that where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And so as we continue to be investing in that way or giving in that way, we are engaging, and we'll have to engage with where's the best place to do that and get in relationship with people that will help us to understand that.
Yeah, thank you. Mark was saying that as Jesus says, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Sort of in the sense of where you put your money, that's where your heart is going to go. It's not the other. We often think of it the other way around. But Jesus actually says, don't wait till you feel it, people. Put money into it, then your heart will get into it. Which I love that strategy for stewardship and giving. All right, let's see. I think that should be our last word for today. Thank you to all of you for being here in the room, and all of you at home and on Zoom. So glad that we can be together this way. Go in the blessing of the Great Spirit. Walk in beauty. I love that blessing. Walk in beauty. It is below you, behind you, above you, around you.